You've heard it a million times, right? Maybe you've even said it. A kid throws a tantrum, a teenager slams a door, and someone says, "Oh, they're just acting out." But what if I told you that the real meaning of that phrase is way more specific and honestly a lot more interesting than just bad behavior? Let's get into it. So here's the breakdown. On one side, you have what most of us think, tantrums, rebellion, just general misbehavior. But then you have the guy who actually came up with the term, Sigmund Freud. And for him, it was something totally different. It was a substitute for a memory, a physical act that takes the place of a thought you can't access, specifically during therapy. The gap between these two is, well, it's huge. So how did we get from a precise clinical term to a cultural catch-all? To figure that out, we have to take a little trip back in time. Picture it, early 20th century Vienna. We're stepping right into the office of Sigmund Freud. This is where it all started. What's really interesting is that the term didn't even start in English. Freud's original word was German, agieren, and it literally just means to act. But for him, this wasn't some casual phrase. Oh no. This was a technical term for a very specific phenomenon he was seeing in his patients. And we get a perfect example of this back in 1905, when Freud wrote about his famous patient, Dora. He noticed that instead of talking about a really difficult memory during their sessions, she would just do something. That action became a stand-in for the words she couldn't say. It was like her body was speaking what her conscious mind couldn't. And this is the absolute crucial point. For Freud, acting out had nothing to do with a kid having a meltdown in public. It was a behavioral discharge, a release of buried memories that was happening during a therapy session. The whole event was tied directly to the treatment process itself. But, ideas evolve, and Freud kept thinking about this. A few years later, in 1914, he added a new layer. He realized that this acting out wasn't just a patient resisting therapy. In a strange, paradoxical way, it was also a form of remembering. The body was literally reenacting something that the conscious mind had pushed away. But a term this juicy, this compelling, there was no way it was going to stay locked up in the analyst's office forever. It was bound to escape into the wider culture. And once it did, well, its meaning started to get stretched. This timeline really shows the journey. We start with Freud in 1905, but now let's jump ahead 60 years. By 1965, people are applying the term to all sorts of social behaviors. And then, just 1 year later, another psychoanalyst, Helene Deutsch, takes it to its absolute extreme. And just like that, acting out became this giant umbrella. I mean, look at this. It suddenly covered everything from impulsivity and personality disorders to addiction and antisocial behavior. And then, get this, even creativity. Bizarre, right? The term was basically being used for almost any behavior that was considered socially unacceptable, and its original precision was completely lost. And this quote from Helene Deutsch really marks the peak of that expansion. We are all actors out. Okay, well, if we're all doing it, then what does the term even mean anymore? It had become so broad, so diluted, that from a clinical standpoint, it was almost meaningless. But this didn't go unnoticed. Back inside the psychoanalytic community, people were starting to get concerned. There was this growing feeling that a really valuable, specific concept had been lost to popular overuse. A course correction was definitely needed. Then, in 1973, 3 analysts, Sandler, Dare, and Holder, made this incredibly forward-thinking argument. They basically said, look, this is a mess, the original meaning is gone. And they suggested a solution. Let's use a different term, enactment, for all that general impulsive stuff. They were, in essence, trying to take their specific term back. And this is the core distinction they wanted to bring back. Acting out would go back to its roots, a specific thing linked to therapy where buried memories come out as actions. And then, enactment could be the broader term for all those general impulsive actions that aren't necessarily tied to therapy. It was a really simple, elegant solution. And here's the amazing part. They were right. Now, it took about 20 years, but their proposed term, enactment, eventually became hugely popular in psychoanalytic circles. It brought back that much-needed clarity, finally answering their call from all the way back in 1973. So, what does this whole journey tell us? It's a pretty fascinating story about the power of a single word, and it shows what can happen when a very technical idea moves from a specialized field into our everyday culture. So, to recap the whole thing, acting out starts as a precise concept in Freud's office. Then it explodes into the mainstream and gets stretched to cover pretty much any impulsive behavior, completely losing its original meaning. And finally, there's a push from within the field to restore that precision by introducing a new term, enactment, for those broader behaviors. It really makes you think, doesn't it? The next time you hear someone described as acting out, you'll know the hidden history behind that phrase, and it kind of leaves us with a bigger question to chew on. What other important, precise ideas have been lost in translation as they move from the clinic to the culture?